Madame du Barry, she lived like a queen, died as an enemy. The wheels of the tumbril groan under the weight of a history they were never meant to carry. It is a rhythmic, mechanical sound, wood grinding against the cobblestones of Paris, marking a pulse that is rapidly slowing down. In the back of this cart sits a woman who was once the most envied creature in the world. Her hair, which used to be a masterpiece of architectural grace, powdered and adorned with the rarest jewels of the French crown, is now shorn into a jagged, uneven mess. The silk dresses that once whispered against the marble floors of Versailles have been replaced by a rough grey shift of prisoner's wool. The crowd lining the streets is a sea of grey and brown, a collective roar of resentment that she can no longer comprehend. To them, she is the ultimate symbol of a parasitic past. To her, they are a terrifying hallucination, a nightmare that has finally breached the palace walls. She looks at the sky, but the sky offers no comfort. It is the color of lead, heavy and indifferent. The guillotine stands waiting in the center of the square, a vertical shadow against the horizon. It is a silent character in this drama, a machine of absolute equality that does not care for the pedigree of the neck it receives. This is the end of the journey for Jeanne du Barry, the woman who climbed from the gutters of Paris to the bed of a king, only to find that the higher you climb, the more devastating the fall becomes. Before the screams of the mob and the cold embrace of the prison cell, there was the silence of the convent and the frantic energy of the Parisian streets. Jeanne was never supposed to be a queen. She was born into the world as an illegitimacy, a mistake of a seamstress and a friar, a child of the shadows who possessed a beauty that was almost an insult to her station. In the 18th century, beauty was a currency, perhaps the only one that could bypass the rigid barriers of bloodline and title. She learned early that her face was a map to a different life. She didn't have the luxury of virtue. She had the necessity of survival. She moved through the city as a shopgirl, a companion, and eventually a high-class courtesan, navigating a world of men who viewed her as an ornament. But Jeanne was more than an ornament. She was a woman of immense psychological intuition. She understood the deep, aching boredom of the aristocracy. She knew that in a world where everything was choreographed, the most valuable thing she could offer was a sense of life, a spark of genuine human warmth that the rigid etiquette of the court had long ago extinguished. When she was introduced to Louis XV, the King of France was a man drowning in the stagnation of his own power. He was surrounded by the ghosts of his predecessors and the crushing weight of a tradition that demanded he be a god while he felt like a fading ember. He had lost his longtime companion, Madame de Pompadour, and the court was a hollow shell of mourning and political maneuvering. Then came Jeanne. She was not a scholar or a political mastermind, but she was a breath of air in a tomb. She laughed without permission. She spoke with a directness that bypassed the layers of flattery the king had endured for decades. To the king, she was not just a mistress. She was a reprieve from the inevitability of his own decline. He didn't just want her. He needed her to convince him that he was still alive. He bestowed upon her the title of Countess du Barry, a legal fiction created through a marriage of convenience to ensure she could be presented at court. It was a scandal that vibrated through every corridor of Versailles. The old nobility, the women who could trace their lineage back to the Crusades, looked at this girl from the streets and saw a contamination. They saw the breakdown of the natural order. Versailles was a labyrinth of mirrors, where every smile was a weapon and every whisper was a death sentence. Jeanne lived at the center of this hive, draped in diamonds that cost more than entire villages, yet she was profoundly alone. The arrival of a young Austrian Archduchess, Marie Antoinette, created a fracture that could never be healed. The Dauphine, raised in the strict moral codes of the Habsburgs, refused to speak to the king's mistress. In the ritualistic world of the French court, a lack of acknowledgement was a public execution of status. For years, the tension between the future queen and the current favorite was the primary engine of court gossip. Jeanne was a woman of pleasure and indulgence, but she was also a woman of immense vulnerability. She knew that her power was entirely derivative. It was a reflection of the king's favor, and like any reflection, it could vanish the moment the light changed. She spent her days in a state of high-alert luxury, surrounding herself with art, flowers, and the finest scents, trying to drown out the growing murmurs of a country that was beginning to starve. Outside the palace gates, The price of bread was rising, and the hatred for the Austrian and the whore was simmering in the hearts of a people who had nothing left to lose. The turning point did not come with a revolution or a riot. It came with a cough. In the spring of 1774, the king began to feel the weight of his years in a way that medicine could not fix. Smallpox, the great leveller of the age, had found its way into the royal bedchamber. The atmosphere of Versailles shifted instantly. The golden light of the Sun King's legacy began to dim, replaced by the smell of vinegar and the hushed tones of doctors and priests. Jeanne sat by his side, watching the man who had been her shield disintegrate. She saw the boils, the fever, and the terrifying clarity in his eyes as he realized that the end was near. In those moments, the hierarchy of the court began to reassert itself. The priests, who had looked the other way during the years of indulgence, now demanded that the king repent. Repentance meant the removal of the occasion of sin. It meant the removal of Jeanne. The inciting incident of her collapse was a slow-motion eviction from the only world she had ever truly conquered. As the king's condition worsened, the pressure to send her away became an ultimatum. She was the physical manifestation of his moral failure, and for him to receive the final sacraments, she had to be purged. On a cold morning, while the king was still breathing, she was told she had to leave. There was no grand farewell, no final embrace. She was ushered into a carriage and driven away from the palace under the cover of darkness, a ghost being exorcised from a haunted house. She went from the pinnacle of the world to the isolation of a convent in a matter of hours. The silence of the carriage was the first taste of the silence that would eventually follow her to the grave. Behind her the king died, and with him died the old France. The new king, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, had no place for the remnants of the previous reign's scandals. Jeanne found herself in a strange purgatory. She was wealthy, she was still beautiful, but she was a woman without a country and without a protector. She eventually moved to her estate at Louveciennes, where she tried to recreate a miniature version of the life she had lost. She filled her gardens with exotic plants and her rooms with the finest furniture, trying to ignore the fact that the world outside was catching fire. She thought she was safe because she was no longer at the center of power. She believed that the revolution, when it finally arrived, would target the crown, not the woman who had been discarded by it. She was wrong. The revolution does not have a surgical memory. It has a blunt appetite. It remembers symbols, not nuances. To the revolutionaries, she was not a victim of the court. She was the court. Her wealth was not hers. It was the stolen blood of the people. Every diamond she owned was a grain of wheat taken from a hungry child. As the years passed and the Bastille fell, the tension in the air became a physical weight. Jeanne made a fatal mistake, the kind of mistake only someone who has lived in a bubble of protection can make. She believed in the sanctity of property. When her jewels were stolen, she traveled to London to recover them, crossing the border between a dying world and a new one multiple times. Each trip was a nail in her coffin. In the eyes of the Committee of Public Safety, these were not trips of a woman seeking her lost property. They were the movements of a conspirator, an agent of the counter-revolution. She was watched by eyes she didn't know existed. Her servants, the very people who had bowed to her for years, were now the eyes and ears of the Republic. The intimacy of her household became the evidence for her prosecution. The moment she returned to France for the last time, she walked into a trap that had been set years before. The gears of the bureaucratic machine began to turn, silent and inevitable. They didn't need a reason to kill her. They only needed a name that represented everything they hated. And Jeanne du Barry was a name that tasted like gold and decadence in the mouths of men who had lived on nothing but bitterness. The protection of the king was a memory, and the cold reality of the tribunal was the only thing left. The woman who had lived as a queen was about to find out that in the eyes of the Republic she was nothing more than an enemy of the people. The shadows at the Château de Louveciennes began to stretch longer than the sun could ever permit. It was a silence that didn't signify peace, but rather the absence of voices that once filled the air with laughter and the clinking of crystal. Jeanne moved through her rooms like a ghost inhabiting its own mausoleum. She could feel the gaze of the world shifting. It was no longer a gaze of desire or even of jealous spite. It had become a cold, analytical stare. The very walls of her sanctuary, once a gift of ultimate love from a king, were now being measured for their weight in gold and their history of perceived sin. Every painting, every gilded chair, and every silk tapestry had become an item on an invisible ledger, held by men who did not know her name, only her reputation. The air in France had changed. It was no longer thick with the scent of lilies and perfume, but with the metallic tang of blood and the dry dust of old documents being burned. She stood at her window, looking toward Paris, a city that was no longer a playground of lights, but a furnace of ideological rage. She was a woman who had spent her life learning how to be seen, yet for the first time, she desperately wished to be invisible. But invisibility is a luxury the revolution does not grant to those who have once stood in the sun. The difficulties began as a slow erosion of her reality. It was not a single blow, but 1,000 small cuts to her autonomy and her sense of safety. The theft of her jewelry in January 1791 was the first true fracture in the facade. To any other person, the loss of gems would be a financial catastrophe, but for Jeanne it was an existential crisis. Those diamonds were her armor. They were the physical proof that she had existed at the right hand of power. Without them, she was just Jeanne Bécu again, a woman with no lineage and no defense. Her decision to pursue the thieves to London was born of a frantic need to reclaim her identity. She made 4 separate trips to the English capital, crossing the Channel at a time when borders were becoming barriers, and every departure was viewed as a desertion. She moved through London society, receiving sympathy from the exiled French nobility, unaware that every dinner she attended and every hand she shook was being recorded by spies of the new republic. She thought she was a private citizen seeking justice. The men in Paris saw a counter-revolutionary agent moving between the enemies of the state. While she was away, her home was no longer hers. The revolution had a way of turning the most intimate spaces into public property. The servants who had once anticipated her every whim now walked the halls with a different stride. Among them was Zamor, the boy who had been brought to her as a novelty, a child from the colonies she had dressed in silks and treated like a living doll. She had given him an education and a life of luxury, but she had never given him dignity. She had treated him as an extension of her own vanity, a decorative proof of her benevolence. In the heat of the revolution, Zamor found a new language. He joined the local Jacobin club, and the woman he once served became the symbol of his oppression. The psychological betrayal was absolute. Jeanne returned to Louveciennes to find that her pet had become her judge. He looked at her not with gratitude, but with the cold clarity of a man who realized that his entire life had been a performance for her amusement. The domestic peace she had tried to maintain was a lie. Her home was now a cell, and the keys were in the hands of those she had once considered beneath her notice. The internal monologue of these days was a frantic negotiation with a god she had only ever addressed in passing. She wondered if the king would have protected her, or if he would have been the first to sacrifice her to save his own neck. She felt the weight of her beauty, once her greatest asset, now a heavy burden that made her a target. She looked in the mirror and saw the lines of anxiety that no amount of powder could hide. She was 50 years old, a dangerous age in a world that was suddenly obsessed with the purity of youth and the fire of ideology. She felt a profound sense of injustice. She had never ordered an execution. She had never manipulated the king for political gain. She had only wanted to be comfortable, to be loved and to be safe. She could not understand how her desire for a soft life had become a capital offense. The existential dread was not about death itself, but about the erasure of her humanity. To the people in the streets, she was a caricature of decadence, a monster of the old regime. They did not see the girl who had worked in a haberdashery or the woman who had nursed a dying king. They saw a target. The pressure mounted as the law of suspects was passed in the autumn of 1793. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. The law was a masterpiece of legal paranoia, defining suspects so broadly that anyone who had ever been associated with the aristocracy was effectively condemned. Jeanne's trips to London, her friendship with British aristocrats, and her very existence as a former royal mistress made her the perfect candidate for the machine. She was no longer a woman. She was a case file. Every act of charity she had performed was reinterpreted as a bribe. Every tear she shed for the executed king and queen was seen as treason. She lived in a state of constant vibrating fear, jumping at the sound of a horse's hooves on the drive or a sudden knock at the door. The revolution had stripped away the layers of her life until there was nothing left but the raw nerve of survival. The turning point arrived with the cold efficiency of a ledger being closed. It was not a dramatic confrontation, but a bureaucratic inevitability. In September 1793, Jeanne was arrested. The agents of the Committee of General Security arrived at Louveciennes not with anger, but with a terrifying professional indifference. They did not care about her history or her pleas. They only cared about the paperwork. As she was being led away from her estate, she looked back at the gardens she had planted, the statues she had commissioned, and the rooms where she had once felt like the center of the universe. It was all being sealed. The Republic was taking possession of her life, piece by piece. She was taken to the Sainte-Pélagie prison, a place where the air was thick with the smell of damp stone and the collective terror of hundreds of others who had fallen from grace. In the prison, the reality of her situation finally breached the walls of her denial. She was surrounded by the very people who had once snubbed her at court, but in the shadow of the guillotine, the old hierarchies had dissolved into a shared democratic fear. The duchesses and the countesses who had refused to speak to her at Versailles were now her cellmates, all of them reduced to the same status, cargo for the tumbrils. She realized then that the revolution was not a correction of the past, but a total annihilation of it. It didn't matter if you were a saint or a sinner, a queen or a courtesan. All that mattered was whether you were useful to the narrative of the moment. Jeanne was no longer useful. She was a relic, and the Republic did not keep relics. The information that changed everything was the news of the trial of Marie Antoinette. When the former queen was executed in October, Jeanne understood that no one was safe. If the blood of the Habsburgs could be spilled on the pavement of the Place de la Révolution, then the blood of a seamstress's daughter was nothing. The last shred of her hope vanished. She began to see the guillotine not as a distant threat, but as a personal destiny. It was a silent presence that sat in the corner of her cell, watching her, waiting for the moment when the clock would strike the final hour. The procedural nature of the terror meant that her death was already written. The trial would only be the formal reading of the sentence. She was caught in a current that was pulling her toward the center of a vortex, and for the first time in her life, there was no man to save her, no king to intervene, and no beauty that could negotiate with the sharp, cold edge of the blade. Her final mistake had been returning to a country that had already forgotten she was a human being. 3. The stone walls of the conciergerie do not echo. They swallow sound. They are damp with the breath of thousands who have passed through these corridors toward the same sharp conclusion. In this place, time does not move in hours, but in the rhythm of the heavy iron keys grinding in their locks. Jeanne is no longer a countess, no longer a favorite, no longer even a woman in the eyes of the law. She is a number on a docket, a piece of evidence to be processed by a machine that has found its perfect velocity. The transition from the relative comfort of her home to the freezing isolation of the prison has stripped away the last of her illusions. Here, the air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, rot, and the metallic tang of fear. Every morning, the list is read. Every morning, names are called that will never be spoken again, except in the past tense. She sits on a thin mattress, her hands once soft and white, now reddened by the cold, listening to the muffled roar of the city outside. Paris is no longer a city of light. It is a city of hunger, and it has developed a taste for the blood of those who once dined on silver plates. The trial of Jeanne du Barry began on a grey morning in December 1793. The Revolutionary Tribunal was not a court of law in any sense that a modern mind would recognize. It was a theatre of ritualized vengeance. The prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, sat like a spider at the center of a web of documents, his eyes cold and devoid of anything resembling human empathy. To him, Jeanne was not a person. She was a symbol of the old regime's absolute corruption. The charges were a chaotic mixture of fact and frantic imagination. She was accused of conspiring with the enemies of the Republic, of sending money to émigrés in London, and of wasting the national treasury on her own vanity. But the true crime, the unspoken one that carried the most weight, was her history. She was the living ghost of Louis XV, a reminder of a time when power was a matter of royal whim rather than revolutionary virtue. The courtroom was packed with the poorest citizens of Paris, women who had watched their children starve, while Jeanne had spent thousands on a single necklace. Their eyes were fixed on her with a predatory intensity. They didn't want justice. They wanted a sacrifice. The most devastating obstacle, the one that truly broke her spirit, was the testimony of those she had once trusted. The revolution has a unique way of turning gratitude into a weapon. Zamor, the boy she had raised, the servant she had treated as a decorative companion, stood before the tribunal. He did not look at her. He spoke with the rehearsed fervor of a true believer, or perhaps a man who knew that if he did not condemn her, he would follow her to the scaffold. He described her as a tyrant, a woman who had used him as a toy, and who secretly plotted for the return of the monarchy. To Jeanne, this was a psychological mutilation. She had believed, in her naive way, that the bonds of her household would hold even when the world was falling apart. She had thought that her kindness, however superficial or condescending it might have been, would buy her loyalty. She realized too late that in a revolution, kindness from the powerful is often seen as the ultimate insult. It is a reminder of the inequality that the mob is determined to erase. Every word Zamor spoke was a shovel of earth on her grave. Inside her mind, a frantic, disjointed monologue took hold. She was a woman who had always navigated the world through the desires of men, and she found herself in a room full of men who felt nothing for her but a cold, ideological hatred. She wondered if she could still bargain. She thought of her jewels, the treasures she had hidden, the gold she had buried at Louveciennes. She convinced herself that if she could only give them enough, they would let her live. She was still thinking in the terms of the old world, where everything had a price and every man had a weakness. She could not grasp the terrifying purity of the terror. The men sitting in judgment of her did not want her gold. They wanted the moral authority that came from destroying someone like her. They wanted to prove that the beauty of the court was nothing but a mask for rot. She felt a profound sense of bewilderment. She was not a politician. She was not a general. She was a woman who had climbed out of the gutter and was now being punished for the height of the climb. The turning point was the realization that the trial was not an inquiry, but a performance with a predetermined end. As the evidence was presented, Jeanne began to speak, her voice trembling and high-pitched. She tried to explain her trips to London. She tried to justify her wealth. But every time she opened her mouth, the crowd erupted in jeers. The judges did not listen. They waited for her to finish, so they could proceed to the next formality. The realization hit her like a physical blow. There was no exit. The legal architecture of the Republic had been designed to ensure that once you were accused, you were already dead. The only thing left was the duration of the wait. She looked at the faces of the jurors, men who had been transformed into extensions of the state, and saw nothing but a blank, terrifying wall of conviction. They were not individuals anymore. They were the people, and the people required a death to validate their struggle. When the verdict was read, the word death echoed through the hall, but it felt strangely abstract to her. It was a sound without a meaning, a vibration in the air. The sentence was to be carried out within 24 hours. This was the procedural cruelty of the revolution, the speed of the collapse. There was no time for appeals, no time for long goodbyes, no time for the mind to process the end of its own existence. She was taken back to her cell, but the cell was different now. It was no longer a temporary holding place. It was the mouth of the tomb. She spent the night in a state of vibrating terror, her mind darting like a trapped bird. She began to write a list, a desperate, pathetic document detailing where she had hidden her treasures. She believed that this list was her ransom. She thought that by giving the Republic her diamonds, she could buy a few more breaths of the damp, cold air of Paris. The guards watched her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They had seen many people die in the last few months. They had seen the stoicism of the aristocrats, the defiance of the politicians and the silent dignity of the Queen. But Jeanne was different. She was a woman who had lived for the senses, for the touch of silk and the taste of fine wine, and she could not find the internal resources to face the void with grace. She didn't want to be a martyr. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to be alive. The psychological depth of her fear was so profound that it stripped away all the layers of her constructed identity. She was no longer the Countess du Barry. She was a terrified human being facing a mechanical, indifferent end. The gold she had spent her life accumulating was now nothing more than a series of marks on a piece of paper, a bribe offered to a machine that did not know how to accept gifts. As the sun began to rise on her final day, the reality of the turning point settled into her bones. The information that her hidden wealth had been accepted for the Republic did not bring the pardon she expected. Instead, it was simply added to the inventory of the state. Her final attempt to negotiate with power had failed because she did not understand that the power had changed. It was no longer held by individuals who could be swayed by greed. It was held by an idea that fed on the destruction of the greedy. The silence of the morning was broken by the sound of the hair cutter, the man who prepared the condemned for the blade. The ritual was beginning. The woman who had once had her hair styled by the greatest artists in Europe now felt the cold steel of the shears against her neck. It was the first touch of the metal that would soon end her story. The transition was complete. She was no longer a person with a past. She was a body moving toward a function. The trial was over, the gold was gone, and the only thing remaining was the walk to the square. 4. The sound of the crowd is a physical weight, a wall of noise that presses against the eardrums until the mind begins to fracture. It is not the sound of a collection of individuals, but the roar of a single multi-headed beast that has been waiting for this moment for decades. In the back of the tumbril, Jeanne du Barry is a portrait of raw, unfiltered human terror. Unlike the aristocrats who preceded her, she does not wear a mask of stoicism. She does not look at the horizon with a frozen, dignified stare. She is screaming. Her voice, once used to whisper endearments into the ear of a king, is now a jagged instrument of desperation. She pleads with the people lining the streets, her words tumbling over one another in a frantic attempt to find a purchase in their hearts. She offers them everything. She tells them where the gold is hidden. She promises them her jewels, her estates, her very soul, if they will only stop the cart. But the cart does not stop. The revolution has no interest in her bargains because it has already decided that her life is the only currency that matters. The cobblestones of the Rue Saint-Honoré are cold and indifferent, vibrating with the passage of the wooden wheels that carry her toward the center of the world's most violent transformation. The climb up the wooden steps of the scaffold is a journey through the absolute collapse of the ego. Each step is a surrender of a piece of her history. On the first step, she is the Countess. On the second, she is the king's favorite. By the third, she is merely a woman who can no longer feel her feet. The air in the Place de la Révolution is thick with the smell of damp earth and the metallic scent of the machine. The guillotine stands there, a towering construction of wood and steel that seems to possess its own gravity. It is the only thing in the square that is silent. It does not join in the jeering of the crowd. It does not react to her cries. It simply exists as the procedural conclusion to a life that dared to rise too high. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, moves with a practiced mechanical efficiency. He has performed this ritual so many times that he no longer sees the person, only the neck. He is the high priest of a secular religion that worships the blade as the ultimate instrument of equality. The moment of no return arrives not with the blade, but with the touch of the executioner's hands. As Sanson reaches for her, Jeanne's desperation reaches a peak that transcends the physical. She utters the words that have echoed through history, a plea that is both pathetic and profoundly human. Just one more moment, Mr. Executioner, just one little moment. It is a request for the one thing that power can no longer grant her: time. She is not asking for a pardon or a miracle. She is asking for a few more seconds of the cold December air, a few more heartbeats before the silence. But the revolution does not have moments to spare. The machine is on a schedule. She is forced onto the plank, her body a trembling weight that the assistants must manage with brute force. The wood of the bascule is hard against her chest, a final cold embrace from the material world she once dominated with silk and velvet. The sky above Paris is a flat, unblinking grey. For a fraction of a second, Jeanne is held in a horizontal purgatory, her neck fitted into the wooden collar of the lunette. She can see the basket below, lined with sawdust that is already stained with the shadows of those who went before her. In this final interval, the entire structure of her life, the poverty of her youth, the glitter of Versailles, the warmth of the king's bed, the isolation of Louveciennes, condenses into a single point of absolute clarity. She was a woman who believed that beauty and favor were permanent shields, only to find that in the eyes of a starving nation, they were actually targets. The lever is pulled. There is a sharp, mechanical click, a sound of metal releasing metal, and then the rush of the blade. It is a sound that does not belong to the world of the living. It is the sound of a curtain being torn. The descent of the blade is the final period at the end of a long, decadent sentence. In an instant, the Countess du Barry ceases to be a political problem, a moral scandal, or a human being. She becomes a trophy. When Sanson lifts her head to show the crowd, the roar that erupts is not one of triumph, but of a dark, communal release. The people have consumed the last vestige of the old world's indulgence. The blood that drips onto the boards of the scaffold is the same color as the blood of the peasants who died in the fields, a final, brutal proof of the equality the revolution promised. The machine has done its work. It has taken the most visible symbol of the king's private life and erased it with procedural indifference. The body is carted away to a mass grave, buried in quicklime to ensure that even her bones will not remain to become relics of a past the Republic is determined to forget. The resolution of Jeanne's story is not found in the silence of her grave, but in the emptiness she left behind. Her estate at Louveciennes was looted, her treasures dispersed, and her name dragged through the mud of revolutionary pamphlets until she was nothing more than a caricature of vice. The very servants she thought she had protected were the ones who divided her spoils. Zamor, the boy who had been her pet, lived on as a bitter reminder of the cruelty that can hide behind a mask of benevolence. The revolution continued its march, eventually turning on the very men who had judged her. Fouquier-Tinville, the prosecutor who had demanded her death, would eventually find himself on the same plank, looking into the same sawdust, realizing too late that the machine he helped build had no loyalty to its creators. The guillotine remained, a silent sentinel in the heart of Paris, watching as the heroes of one day became the victims of the next. What does the death of Jeanne du Barry reveal about the nature of power and the fragility of status? It shows us that when the social contract breaks, it breaks with a violence that spares no one. She was a woman who navigated the world through the intimate politics of the bedroom, a world of whispers and favors. She was unprepared for the world of the street, a world of slogans and steel. Her mistake was not her decadence, but her belief that she was separate from the people she had risen above. She thought that by changing her name and her dress, she had changed her destiny. But the revolution has a long memory and a short temper. It does not forgive those who forget where they came from, and it does not allow the past to remain buried when it can be used to fuel the fires of the present. As we look back at the collapse of her world, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality of our own positions. We live in a world that is still defined by status, by wealth, and by the precariousness of our own protections. We like to believe that we would have acted differently, that we would have been the ones to resist the madness or to stand with dignity in the face of the end. But the story of Jeanne du Barry is a reminder that fear is the great equalizer. When the tumbril comes for you, will you find the strength to be a martyr, or will you, like her, beg for just one more moment? At what point does our pursuit of a comfortable life become a form of complicity in the systems that eventually consume us? The tragedy of the French Revolution is not just the death of the guilty, but the systematic destruction of the human element in the pursuit of an abstract ideal. Jeanne was not a monster. She was a woman who wanted to survive, and to be happy in the only way the 18th century allowed a woman of her birth to do so. She was a product of her time, and she was destroyed by the very forces that her time had set in motion. History does not execute only the tyrants and the enemies of the state. It executes the ordinary, the vain, the lucky, and the beautiful. It executes anyone who happens to be standing in the path of a changing tide. We must understand that the safety we feel today is a thin veneer, a fragile agreement that can be torn away by the same currents of paranoia and resentment that fueled the terror. The guillotine is never truly gone. It only changes its shape. It lives in the rhetoric of exclusion, in the speed of the mob, and in the terrifying efficiency of a bureaucracy that has lost its soul. Jeanne du Barry's final scream was not just for her own life, but a warning to all of us that the distance between the palace and the scaffold is much shorter than we care to admit. In the end, we are all just one moment away from the silence. We must decide, while we still have the breath to speak, what kind of world we are building and whether we are willing to pay the price of our own survival. Because when the blade finally falls, it does not matter who you were or what you believed. All that remains is the question of what you left behind when the light went out.